I think when feminist writers write about men, there's this kind of expectation that it's going to be a kind of lacerating, punishing experience. But I really did try not to do that.
Right.
I tried to be nicer.
No, and you've dedicated the whole book to Michael Douglas.
Yeah, so, I do like sweet. Him.
You're listening to Radio Free Mike. Welcome to Radio Free Mike, the podcast about freedom and its discontents. My name is Michael Scott Moore, and today we're talking to Jessa Crispin, a critic and nonfiction writer who also edits the arts and commentary website The Culture We Deserve. She originated one of the first online book blogs called Book Slut in the early 2000s. She's a feminist as well as a critic of feminists, and her new book, What is Wrong with Men?, studies the rise and fall of American manhood through a close reading of Michael Douglas's movie roles from the mid-'80s through the late 90s. We'll talk about that, as well as her previous book, My Three Dads, about patriarchy on the Great Plains of Kansas, where she's from. Jessa, welcome.
Hi.
Hi. I liked your book.
Thanks.
I noticed that this book, as well as My Three Dads, they both start off kind of early with a discussion of hysteria. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what hysteria was thought to mean back in ancient Greece?
Well, in ancient Greece, it was thought that if you were upset, if you were a woman, then maybe your uterus would just move around your body and cause chaos, because it was also thought that your uterus released vapors. And so if your uterus was near your brain releasing uterine vapors, that was bad.
You don't want that.
No. So you need to get the uterus in place via pregnancy, via sex, but mostly pregnancy, let's be clear, in order to get your sort of female body functioning again and get your brain right.
Right.
But this was basically, hysteria was a diagnosis that could be anything that nobody could figure out what was wrong with you. So it could be mental illness, it could be stomach trouble, it could be anything could be immediately sort of blamed to hysteria if they just couldn't figure it out. So
right. And what kind of vapors was the uterus supposed to be giving off?
I don't know. I do wonder that sometimes, like, what did they smell like? Uterine vapors, like, did they have a kind of green tinge? There's a lot to work with there, but unfortunately they were not very detailed about the vapors.
Yeah, that doesn't come up in Greek tragedy or Greek poetry.
No,
all that much. Yeah.
It's really a shame. Think of all the art we could have had about uterine vapors. Seriously, or maybe it was, but we only have the unpainted, sculpted, colorless version. Yeah, exactly.
No. Lost to history. And the idea was that women were hysterical and therefore they shouldn't have power.
Right. Well, they're prone to hysteria. And that they were more likely to be hysteric if they weren't able to fulfill sort of feminine duty, right? Of that the cure for hysteria was often linked to getting married, having babies, getting and because that was making sure that your biological function was being used appropriately, and that would sort of stabilize your condition. So yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful metaphor.
Yeah, it is.
And it's why all the feminists write about it, because I mean, come on.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. And at the beginning of, towards the beginning of my Three Dads, you start to go into other models. In fact, a lot of your books do this, but you go into other models of arranging society that are, either more just or more palatable to Jessa Crispin.
Yes.
And
yes,
one
to me specifically,
to you specifically,
that society to my
that's
benefit, yes.
That's what I feel like the entire project of your books is. How can we arrange society so that it's more appropriate for you to live in?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Please, someone get on that. That's why they will never let me be president. But other things as well.
Well, one solution, you describe yourself as completely unsuited to a commune, which was funny. Those were good pages. And then you mentioned another alternative that was a little bit common in European cities called the béguinage. In other words, the béguine, which was a sort of secular nunnery.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, there've always been communes as like a solution to the problems of the family, right? Well, not always, but since people have been like, well, this is a problem, we should do something about it. They're like, well, what if we all just live together communally? And I was like, that sounds like a nightmare.
Right.
It just seems it's like the worst possible way to arrange a world for Jessa Crispin's flourishing. And I understand the impulse, but also it has not historically worked out to sort of erase deeply entrenched gender roles, right? Like Charles Fourier noticed that when people were living communally, that the men were not doing any chores, and it just didn't occur to them. And it did occur to the women, so they would just like go into these defaults. And so it wasn't doing what people hoped it would be doing, which is like if you're you can share labor, you can share responsibility, you can share troubles, and it turns out that nobody wants to do the dishes, and women will do it if no one else will be doing it. But there have been a lot of different trying to figure out how do you take care of women outside of the family? And so the sort of, secular convents, and they sort of vary in their levels of secularity, I guess, is but depending on which city, which church, etc., was in charge of these things, like how much of a sort of religious overtone they had. But basically they were like small communities / villages that women who were leaving the comfort and safety of their beloved family in order to come to urban centers during the Industrial Revolution to work in factories, they needed places to stay. And so the church provided these communities, and they were like half commune, half nunnery. But they were not as strict, and also it gave women sort of autonomy over their money. They had a place to live without having to get married, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of women stayed for a long time. Yeah,
and they started fairly early. I mean, you described one, I think, in Amsterdam that got going in the 1300s or even the 13th century.
Yeah. So they were much more widespread later on, but they did start much earlier. But it was always during these times of like economic shift when people were having to move in large numbers from agricultural villages into a city in order to labor there. And so removing people from their own family systems or own community systems. And there was a sense from the church of like, I mean, a lot of this was misogynist bullshit of just like, they're gonna have the sex. Just let them go to the city.
So what do we do with all the single ladies?
Right.
So
what do we
gather
what
them
do we do
into
with
this
them?
community? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we gotta house them. We gotta control them.
House them.
Yeah, but you had to leave if you had a baby, but you could come back if you left. If you fed the baby to the wolves.
If you fed the baby, left the baby out in the elements.
There are things you can do.
Right. And that seemed to you like a really ideal organization because, first of all, it was communal, but it wasn't. But there were no men. Basically.
There were no men. There was varying levels of privacy, but that was, of course, like determined by how much money you had, which is always how it goes. You determine your level of privacy by how much money you have, like how much you can separate yourself from other people. So the poor women were in big rooms, lots of beds, that kind of stuff. But you made enough money, you could graduate to a single,
have your own apartment.
Yeah.
And were they places of creative ferment? I mean, in some ways. I mean, did you mentioned some artists and philosophers who came out of the beguinages? Yeah,
I mean, most of them though were there because they were working in textile factories.
They had
and that
labor.
Sort of stuff. Yeah. So I think maybe the church was more of a actual sort of space for female creation. Nuns were artists, philosophers, composers, etc. Like probably maybe at a higher rate than in the Beguinage, but yeah, of course there were books written and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And some of them still exist. You went to an existing one in Amsterdam, but I've noticed that some. I don't think there is one in Berlin.
No, not anymore.
But some properties in Berlin are still owned by the church because the church obviously used to be a huge property owner, and I've noticed that some apartments you can find in Berlin are fairly cheap because the church is your landlord, but you have to obey a certain, some rules.
Yeah, of course.
You have to get in by a certain time. They have curfews and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I feel like I could do that.
Yeah. Good. And in your new book, by way of describing a new way of arranging the world, you look at basically Michael Douglas's arc through his Hollywood career as a way of tracing the American man and his role in society, and his attitudes towards women and that sort of thing. So as far as you're concerned, Michael Douglas maps onto the mainstream American male ethos.
Yeah. I know that sounds insane, but no,
No, it works. So that's the thing. First of all, it does work in your essays.
Yeah, it does work.
But how? So why Michael Douglas?
Well, he was sort of the avatar of a kind of new masculinity. And for the most part, I focus on like 1984 to 1997, which is this arc of what was the first one? Romancing the Stone to The Game. Right. And this was sort of like peak Michael Douglas, couldn't do any wrong kind of Michael Douglas. But I mean, he was just in, banger after banger. But
Romancing the Stone was not a banger. Romancing the Stone.
That was a huge success, man.
It was a success.
Yeah. It's a really good movie.
I haven't seen it since the 80s. So
it's a really good movie.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this has been a free preview of this episode. And the whole thing is open to paid subscribers to Radio Free Mike. So if you'd like to hear the rest, please hit the link in your show notes or in the body of the email we've sent you, and upgrade your subscription over at Substack. Then you'll be able to listen to the full episode on any platform. Thanks for listening. Keep me out of country.